So today's daf is Kuf Yud Zayin, and we'll begin on the bottom of Kuf Tes Zayin. The Gemara had quoted a brisa in the name of Rab Shimon Bar Yochai in terms of the way the machnos, the encampments, were divided up during the period of Shiloh. Meaning, Shiloh is going to be, according to Rab Shimon Ben Yochai, an exception to the rule. The normal rule with regard to the Beis Hamikdash, with regard to the Mishkan in the Midbar, was that there were three different machnos. There was the Machna Shechina, the Machna Leviah, and the Machna Yisrael. But in Shiloh, according to the Brisa, recording a statement of Shimon Bar Yochai, there was only two machnos. So we're going to look at Hai Minayu Lo Hava. Which one was missing of the three? So that you'll see on the second line before the bottom of Kuf Tes Zayin Amud Beis. Omar Rabba Mistabra, it's logical, the Machna Leviah Havai. Now, the Machna Shechina itself was certainly there because the Machna Shechina is where the Mishkan is in Shiloh. So Shiloh certainly had a Machna Shechina. That's unquestionable. There are two other possibilities as to which one was missing in Shiloh. It's either the Machna Leviah or the Machna Yisrael. Comes along Rab and he says, no, it's got to be the Machna Leviah. The Isal Kedaitoch, if you can entertain the possibility that Machna Leviah Lohavi, meaning that there were only two Machnas in Shiloh, the Machna Shechina and the Machna Yisrael, and here we start today's daf. Nimtzeu Zavin Utmei Mesim Mishtalchim Chutz L'Machna Achas. Now, as we're going to see in a minute, based on a pasuk at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, there is a fundamental distinction between Tumas Mes and Tumas Ziva. In the case of Tumas Mes, the Tamei Mes has to be excluded from the Machna Shechina alone, and he's not removed from the Machna Leviah. In the case of Zava, or Zav, which is what we call a Tuma Yotzis Migufo, the Torah was more Machmir, and the Torah requires that the Zav be sent out, not only excluded from Machna Shechina, but also from Machna Leviah and sent to the Machna Yisrael. But now if you're telling me that there's no Machna Leviah, then there's no difference between a Tomei Mes and a Zav. Both will be sent out of the Machna Shechina into the Machna Yisrael. And yet the Torah says, Lo Yitamu Es Machanehem. And why is the word Machanehem in the plural? Tein Machna Lezeh, Machna Lezeh, that the Torah is saying two Machnos, meaning there's a separation between a Tomei Mes, on the other hand, who is allowed into the Machna Leviah, as opposed to Tumayotis Meguf in the case of a Zav, who's excluded even from Machna Leviah, but now they're equal. And you're making a pasuk in the Torah into a non-entity. It can't be. Amalei Rava says to Rabbi, you haven't solved the problem. Why? Elamai, what are you going to say that Machna Yisrael Havi? By definition, we know that the Machna Shechina was there. Now you're saying that the Machna Leviah was there. And then by definition, you're excluding the Machna Yisrael, and it didn't exist in Shiloh. Then you're in trouble anyway. Why? Because Nimtzu Zavid Mitzorah Mishlach L'Machem Echad. The Torah says Tein Machna Lezeh to differentiate between not only a Tomei Mes and a Zav, but also between a Zav and a Metzorah. The Metzorah is sent out of all the Machnos. But now you're telling me that if there's no Machna Yisrael, then the whole world is all the same. Meaning, once you go beyond Machna Leviah, there's no difference between one place and the other. So that whether you send out a Zav from the Machna Leviah or you send out a Metzorah from the Machna Leviah, it's all the same. So you've reduced to naught, to a null set, the distinction between a Zav and a Metzorah. VaTorah Amar Barad Yeshev. But not only that, the Torah tells us that the Metzorah is not allowed to be with anyone. He's in total isolation. He's totally secluded. Barad Yeshev. And that means that Shelo Yeshev Tamei Acher, he can't even be together with another Tamei. Now you're telling me that the Zav is sent out of the Machne Leviah to anywhere, and that anywhere is where the Mitzorah is sent to, and therefore the Mitzorah is together with the Zav. El Elyon Kulo Tlosahavi. We have to go back to the square one and rewrite the text of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. There were three machnos in the Mishkan of Shiloh. So what did Rav Shimon Bar Yochai mean when he said in the Bryce there were only two machnos in Shiloh? And the answer is Leklita. We're talking about where the Rotzech B'Shogeg has Klita to protect him from the Goel Hadam, and a Machne Leviah, where the Levium live, that's where they're protected. Anybody's protected. There are six designated cities of refuge, and in addition to that, all the other 42 cities of the Levium were also protective of the Rotzech B'Shogeg. That's called Klita. And then what we're saying is that after Klal Yisrael left the Midbar and entered into Eretz Yisrael, they went to Shiloh eventually. And Reb Shimon Bar Yochai is saying that in Shiloh, as opposed to the Midbar before they got out of the Midbar into Eretz Yisrael, in Shiloh there was no Klita in the Machne Leviah. So there was a Machne Leviah, and therefore you could fulfill the mitzvah of Shiluach Hatmeim and make that distinction between Tein Lezeh and Tein Lezeh, right? Machne Lezeh, Machne Lezeh. But the power of Klita was not inherent in the Machne Leviah during the period of Shiloh, which has to be understood why that's so, but that's what Reb Shimon Bar Yochai has in mind. And the Gemara is going to say that Mechlal to Midbar Havi Klita Machne Leviah, that what Reb Shimon Bar Yochai is saying that as long as even the Midbar, then there was a Machne Leviah. That's where Moshe Rabbeinu was. He was a Levi, and there was Klita, but there was no Klita when they got to Shiloh. Now, is that really so? The Gemara wants to now check out and investigate whether or not in the Midbar there was Klita to protect the Rotzeh B'Shogeg from the Gol Adam in the Machne Leviah. That's what we're going to embark upon and check out. Okay, then. So the Gemara answers in. It's true, there was a Klita of the Machne Leviah at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu in the Midbar, and I'll prove it to you. Vatanya, we learned it in a Brisa. The Brisa is darshaning a pasuk in Shmos. It says, "V'samti l'cha makom," and when the Torah is describing the appointment of the, let's say, designation of Ari Miklat for Klita to Moshe Rabbeinu, it says, L'cha makom. And what does L'cha teach me? B'chayecha, during your lifetime. So that means that Moshe Rabbeinu, during his lifetime, was able to appoint and designate Ari Miklat. And then it says, Makom, Mekomcha. Mekomcha means where your machna is, and we know that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Levi, and his machna was Machne Leviah. And Asher Yonas Shama, Melamed Shemegalim Bamidbar. That even in the Midbar there was Golus, meaning a Rotzeh B'Shogeg ran into a city of refuge, Lahechan Golim, and it was La Machne Leviah. So we see clearly from this brisa, we didn't finish the brisa yet, but we already got to the point where we could derive a conclusion that there was a klita of the Machne Leviah in the Midbar, and that's what Shimon Bar Yochai says, that when they went into Eretz Yisrael and they established the Mishkan at Shiloh, there was no klita of a Machne Leviah, but there was a Machne Leviah as far as the din and the mitzvah of Shiluach Tmeim Min HaMachnos. And Mikan Omer, the Brisa concludes that Ben Levi Shahorag Gole Mipelech Lepelech. Now, what happens over here? A Ben Levi lives in a city of Levium, and therefore he already has Klita. But the Torah requires that a Rotzeh B'Shogeg go into Golus and he leave his hometown. So therefore, in the case of Ben Levi Shaharag, he's got to leave from one Ir Mikla to another, because he's already in an Ir Mikla, maybe an Ir Levim, and he goes to a different city. So he goes from one city to another city. V'im gola lepilcho, pilcho kolto. The truth is, the Brisa points out that, again, Rashi says it's only b'di'evet, but he could go from one shchuna to another shchuna, one neighborhood to another neighborhood within his own city. And that itself is a kiyum of golus. And we see very clearly, which is a subject matter for Masechet Makkos, that there is a mitzvah on the shoulders of a rotzech to go into a rotzech peshog to go into golus. The Gemara says, "My kra," and it's very nice that that the Brisa adds this point that a Ben Levi who kills B'shogeg goes, from Pelach to Pelach. How do we know this? Omarav Achav Ki be'ir miklato yeshev ir shekol kvar. In other words, there was a potential klita and a protection in that city because he lives in that city of a Levium. He's a Levi, and therefore he has the klita. But the Torah is saying that even though he was already niklat in that city, he should pick up and reestablish himself in a different city. Okay, now the Mishnah says, Bo Gilgal. Once they came to Gilgal, then there was a heter bamos, meaning during the time of the Mishkan, there was no heter bamos, no ability to, just set up your own, backyard or on the rooftop altar and shech your karbanos. No. But once they came into Eretz Yisrael, they went to Gilgal for 14 years during what's called Kibush V'chiluk. There was a heter bamos. Now the question is, what is the scope of the heter bamos? Meaning, what kind of karbanos are you allowed to bring in a bama? And the Brisa is going to present many shittas in the Tanoim about this question, exactly what the parameters and the scope of which karbanos you can bring in a bama. And after bringing all the different Tanoim, the Gemara is going to go through an analysis of each Tana and the Psukim and so forth and so on. So first we're going to start with Rabbi Meir. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa. And this is Rabbi Meir, called Nidar v'Nidav. These are different types of voluntary karbanos. One is called the Neder, the other is called the Nedava. Hayakar b'Midbar. Meaning that if you have an obligatory carbon, like a chatos and an asham, you cannot bring it on a bama. You can only bring a carbon nedava, voluntary carbon, on a private bama. Now, are there any karbanos that sound like, I call it the gray area, like a carbon chova, but even so, Rabbi Meir would allow you to bring it on a bama? And yes, there are. There's a mincha unazirus kravim bebama. So let's focus on, for a moment, nazirus. A man was makabel on himself nazirus, which means he has to abstain from drinking wine and from entering into a cemetery and be makabel tuma. And then he's not allowed to cut his hair. At the end, terminating his nazirus, he's got to bring a whole set of karbanos. Comes along Rabbi Meir and he says that those karbanos are basically neder unedava, they're voluntary karbanos, because he's only obligated in these karbanos because he voluntarily accepted upon himself benazirus to be a nazir. But Chachamim Omer, they disagree. They say lo karvu yochid el olos shlom bevad. A nazir cannot bring his karbanos on a bamas Yachid, meaning on a private bama, because this was a carbon chova. The Torah said that he has to bring these karbanos. However, olos and shlamim, which are karbanos that can be brought voluntarily, the Chachamim agree to Rabbi Meir that those could be brought on a bamas yachid. So you have ola and shlamim, which are karbanos nidava that he took upon himself. Although there are exceptions to the rule where you have a carbon ola that's a chova, and you have a korban shlamim even that's a chova. But in general, there are nedavos of ola and shlamim. However, going back to the Nazirus korban, no. The Chacham disagree, and they hold that Nazirus is a korban chova. So basically, there's a fundamental machlokas how to understand the karbanos that a Nazir brings at determination of Nazirus, whether it's a chova or a nedava. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Now we get to a third shita. Kol shatzibur vayochim makrivim be'ol moed sheba midbar makrivim be'ol moed sheba Gilgal. Now again, the ol moed sheba Gilgal is a reference to the bama that was set up as a communal bama during the 14 years after Yeshua crossed the Jordan, and that's during the time of Heter Bamos. And Rabbi Yehuda holds that any korban that could be brought by either the tzibur or the yachid during the period of the Mishkan in the Midbar could be brought in Gilgal on a Bamas Tzibur. Now let's understand that the Mishkan in Gilgal had the status of a Bamas Tzibur. Again, we'd have to really get into deep issues to figure out what's the status of a Bamas Tzibur during the time of Heter Bamos. It's not exactly a Mishkan, it's not exactly a Mikdash. Haraya that there is a Heter of Bama, but nevertheless it does have certain special status. And therefore, let's just summarize Rabbi Yehuda's Shita and figure out how he disagrees with the first two Tanoim. And Rabbi Yehuda holds that there's no difference between Karbanos in the Midbar and Karbanos in Gilgal against Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. And we're talking about, let's say, a Chatos and an Osham, which according to Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim cannot be brought during the time of Gilgal, because they are Karbanos Chova. So while they were in the Midbar and the Mishkan stood, a person who incurred a Chiyuv Ola, a Chiyuv Chatos, and a Chiyuv Osham would bring that Karban to the Mishkan in the Midbar, but in Gilgal, according to Rabbi Meir and the Chacham, he cannot bring. So comes along Rabbi Yehuda and he says, no, any category of Karban that could be brought during the period of Midbar, meaning even a Chovas Yachid, an individual obligation of Chatos or Osham, could be brought in Gilgal. So basically, Rabbi Yehuda now has expanded the parameters of a Heter Bama to include even a Chovas Yachid. But now the question is, so what is the difference between the time period in which the Mishkan stood in the Midbar? Again, it was taken from place to place, as opposed to Gilgal in the 14 years of Kibush V'Chiluk. Ma bein ol moed shebe Midbar levein oel moed shebe Gilgal. In other words, what do we mean when we say that there was some sort of a Heter Bamos in Gilgal? And the answer is because all moed should be b'lohaya bamos mutaros, right? The only korbanos you could bring during the period of 40 years in the Midbar was in the Mishkan, the Mizbeach and the Mishkan. But all moed should be b'lohaya mutaros. In other words, you can bring a private, you can set up a private altar anywhere during the period of time of Gilgal, so that Gilgal does not have the status really of a full-fledged Mikdash to generate an Isur Bamos, and there's a Heter Bamos. And if there's a Heter Bamos, then Rabbi Yehuda goes a step further and he says that Heter Bamos includes even a Karban Chova, which would mean an Ola. I'm sorry, I keep saying Ola. I meant to say a Chatos and an Osham. Ubamaso sheberosh gago lohaya makar v'leh el ola ushlam. Okay. So now, Rabbi Yehuda makes an important shift over here. And he says that the Mishkan in Gilgal which, as we said before, was a semi-mishkan and not a full mishkan because there was a heter bamos. That mishkan, which is called a bamas tzibur, would be equal to the mishkan in the midbar according to Rabbi Yehuda, as far as bringing a korban yachid. So it means, according to Rabbi Yehuda, if an individual voluntarily accepts upon himself a korban nidava, then he could bring that korban nidava either in the Mishkan in Gilgal or outside the Mishkan with the heter bamos. What about chatos v'osham, a chovas yachid? That, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he could bring during the period of Gilgal on the bamas tzibur, but he could not bring it outside of the bamas tzibur because the heter bamos for a bamas yachid was limited to olos and shlamim, which lend themselves to a korban nedava. Now we have another quote in the Bryce of another Shita, the Chachamim, but this seems at the face of it to be a repeat, an identical Shita to the Chachamim that we learned until now. The Gemara is going to try to analyze the difference between these Chachamim and the Oskal. Chachamim, Kol Shahat Tzibu Makrivim B'ol Moed Pamidbar, Makrivim B'ol Moed Shebe Gilgal, V'kan Lo Karvu Yochid Ela Ola Ushlamim Bilvad. So if we're talking about the Yachid, and we're not talking about the Tzibur, then according to these Chachamim, which seem to be identical with the previous Chachamim, they can only bring an Ol and Shlamim. Why? Because those are Korbanos Nidava. And it comes under the law of Ein Nidar V'Nidav, Ein, right, Karev B'Bama, because it's a voluntary karma. So that only fits in with Ola and Shlamim. But then a Chatos and an Osham cannot be brought outside of the Mishkan. And he points out already here in the footnote that the Gemara later on will ask, there seems to be no difference in the opinion of this opinion and that of the Chachamim cited above. Both maintain that only Olos and Shlamim could be brought for the Yachid as a Karma Nidava, both at a private Bama and at a communal Bama. Okay, so now we go on to Kuf Yud Zayin Amid Bey. So let me just set this up here.